After his best friend's death, he stayed to help the family, but found something he never expected. Before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe and follow Tender Bonds. Like and share our story. Silas knew the toolbox was in the wrong place. He'd moved it from the garage shelf to the passenger seat of his truck the morning after the funeral without deciding to, and 6 weeks later it was still there, riding beside him on every errand like a passenger who didn't require conversation. Miller Gantt's name was scratched into the lid in the blocky capitals of a man who'd learned to write in a school that didn't last long enough to refine him. The rust had come up through the letters over the years, darkening them, until now they looked almost deliberate, the kind of thing you might see above a bar that wanted to seem old. Silas drove. The fields outside Dunmore ran gray and flat under a sky the color of old bone, and the truck's heater made a sound like something trying to breathe. Cass had called him at 6 in the morning. Not at dawn. Dawn was a word for other places. In Dunmore in January, the light arrived like an apology, pale and unconvincing, and at 6 it wasn't even that yet. He'd been awake already. He'd been awake for most of the 6 weeks since Miller died, lying in his apartment above the hardware store on Crane Street, listening to the building settle in the cold. "It's the kid," she'd said. "Trace has got a fever and I can't get the truck started and I don't know who else." She hadn't said his name first. No Silas, no hello, just, "It's the kid." He'd understood that she wasn't asking. She was stating a fact and waiting to see if he would find himself in it. He'd found himself in it. He'd known Miller for 22 years. He'd picked the toolbox up from the passenger seat when he went inside, not sure why, just carrying it. And now it sat on Cass's porch while he held a cup of coffee she'd handed him without asking how he took it, because she already knew. He looked at the lid. He remembered the first time he'd seen Miller open it. The summer Silas came to work the line at Federated Stamping, and Miller was the one showing him how to stand next to the machine without getting hurt. Not how to run it, just, don't get hurt. Don't let the other guy get hurt. Go home. Silas had filed that away alongside the 2 or 3 other pieces of wisdom he'd collected in his 38 years and found it held up better than most. Miller had married Cass Purdue when they were both 26, and she was already expecting Trace. Silas had been best man at the wedding in the basement of the First Methodist on Vine, which smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and somebody's aunt's gardenia perfume. He'd stood beside Miller at the front of the room and watched Miller's shoulders, broad and still, the way a working man's shoulders get when he's made a decision he doesn't intend to revisit, and thought that Miller was the most settled person he'd ever known. Not happy, exactly. Settled. As though he'd located the center of gravity in his own life and arranged himself around it without any drama about having done so. Silas had spent the better part of his life trying to understand how a person did that. Now, going inside with the toolbox in his hand, he wasn't sure it was something you decided. Trace was 7. He was in the recliner in the front room with a blanket to his chin, and his face the color a sick child's face goes, yellowish and ancient-looking, the color of old newspaper. He had Miller's nose and Cass's eyes, and the habit both of them had of watching a person from slightly to the side of direct, as though they needed to triangulate your intentions before committing to acknowledging you. "Hey, Bud," Silas said. "Hey." Cass came out of the kitchen. She was in jeans and a gray sweatshirt, her hair back, and there were the shadows under her eyes that had been there since November. She had not become beautiful in grief. She had become essential-looking, the way a tool looks when it's the only one that will do the job. She looked at him and then at the toolbox. "You didn't need to bring that." "The truck needed the antifreeze topped off anyway," he said. Which was not an answer, but she let it go the way you let things go when children nearby have fevers. He sat with Trace while Cass made oatmeal. The television was on, one of those morning programs where people sat on a couch and laughed at things that weren't funny, and they watched it the way people watch television in houses where something bad has recently happened, not seeing it, just using the noise as company. Trace's temperature was 102, Not high enough for the hospital, high enough to sit with. Dad used to do the voices, Trace said, not looking at Silas, looking at the screen. For the commercials. He made up what they were really saying. Yeah, Silas said, he did that. A pause. The commercial was for laundry detergent. A woman in a bright kitchen, holding a white shirt, examining it the way you examine evidence. What's she really saying? Trace asked. Silas looked at the screen. He thought of Miller's voice, lower than you expected from his frame, a voice that came from somewhere careful. She's saying, Silas said, that this shirt has seen some things and she's not going to talk about it. Trace almost smiled. A quarter smile produced with enormous effort, and it cost Silas something he couldn't have named. He'd started coming around in December, 2 weeks after the funeral. Not every day, not with any plan. He'd come because Cass's truck had a belt that was going. He'd mentioned it to Miller back in October, and Miller had said, I'll get to it in the way that men say they'll get to things. And then there had been the aneurysm, quick and total, which the doctors said was a mercy, which Silas had been told repeatedly to regard as something other than what it was, a door closing. He'd replaced the belt. Then a week later the water heater went, and he came back for that. Then the storm door hinge. He told himself it was a list with an end point. He was not a person who examined his own motives closely. He'd found over 38 years that close examination didn't tend to improve what it found. What he knew about himself. He had no family in the state. He'd had a woman, Joni Marsh, for 4 years in his 30s, and she'd moved to Columbus for a job, and he hadn't moved with her and had told himself and her that it was the apartment, the job at the hardware store, the usual things. All of those things were true. None of them were the reason. Miller had been the exception to almost everything. The one person in Dunmore who seemed to understand that Silas's silence was not unfriendliness, but a shyness so old it had calcified into what looked, from the outside, like solitude by preference. He'd preferred it. He just hadn't understood what he was choosing. The pipe went at 2 in the morning in the 3rd week of January. The temperature had dropped 14 degrees in 6 hours. A front off Lake Erie, the kind that didn't send warnings, just arrived and began. Silas was in the 2nd bedroom, Miller's old workshop, which Cass had put a cot in without discussion. After the 2nd time, Silas stayed too late doing repairs and fell asleep on the couch. He heard the sound, not water but pressure that had run out of patience. A low crack from the utility room, and then the hiss, and then Cass's voice, sharp and unambiguous. Silas. He was already moving. Not awake exactly, but moving, which was its own kind of waking. The utility room was behind the kitchen, a narrow space with the furnace and water heater and washer, and the pipe that had given was the supply line to the washing machine, a copper elbow cracked clean by the freeze. Water moved across the utility room floor toward the kitchen linoleum in a slow, purposeful sheet. Where's the main shutoff? Cass said. She was in the doorway behind him, and her voice was the voice of someone who is frightened and has decided that won't be the important thing right now. He was already going past her, through the kitchen, out the back door in his socks onto the frozen ground, the cold a physical event that turned the inside of his nose to metal. The main valve was in the utility box by the foundation. His hands found it in the dark by touch, by knowledge accumulated from 6 weeks of learning where things lived in this house, and he turned it and held it until the pressure bled down to nothing. Back inside, Trace was in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, pale and alert. Go back to bed, Bud, Silas said. His voice came out steady. He noticed that. Is the house broken? Just a pipe. I'll fix it in the morning. Trace considered this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds apply to structural failure. Can you? Yeah. Cass was already at the utility room with the old towels from under the sink, bent to the floor, working systematically, economical, without complaint. Silas went to help, and for a time they worked in the tight space without speaking, moving with the close quarters ease of people who have learned each other's geometries without meaning to. Her reach preceded his need. His elbow went where hers wasn't. At some point, she sat back on her heels and looked at the cracked fitting, then at him. "This is going to sound wrong," she said. "Probably not. I don't know how I'd do this without you here." He looked at the fitting too. The crack ran diagonally across the copper elbow, clean as a decision. "You'd figure it out," he said. "I know I would. That's not what I'm saying." The furnace ticked and ran. Outside, the wind found the corner of the house and made its opinion known. "I know what you're saying," he said. She nodded once, and they went back to the towels. He told himself when this started that he was doing it for Miller, that this was the thing a man did when his best friend's heart gave out at 51 in the parking lot of Federated Stamping on a Tuesday in November. You stepped into the absence and held the shape of the life that had been there, so the people inside it didn't feel the full force of the void all at once. He told himself this was love, which it was. He told himself it was selfless, which it was not. He understood that now, in the way you understand things that come through the body and not the mind. Standing on the frozen ground in his socks with his hands on the shut-off valve in the dark, knowing exactly where it was, knowing exactly what it needed. In that moment he had not been performing grief or executing a promise. He had simply been where he was, present, required. He could not remember the last time before November that anything had required him. He fixed the pipe on a Saturday. He'd ordered the fitting at cost from the hardware store and came in the morning with his tools spread on the utility room floor. Trace sat on the washing machine and watched with the focused attention of a child trying to learn everything before anyone thinks to stop teaching him. Why does it crack? Water expands when it freezes. The pipe can't go with it, so something gives. Can you make a pipe that expands? They make flexible supply lines. I should put those in before next winter. He said it without thinking, before next winter, and after it was said he felt the weight of it settle into the room. Trace looked at him. Silas cleaned the pipe ends with emery cloth, applied the flux, set the new elbow. "Dad couldn't do this stuff," Trace said. "Not a criticism. Information sorted into categories. Your dad could do other things." "Like what?" Silas set the torch to the joint and watched the flux bubble and the solder follow it, bright and liquid. "He knew when to show up," Silas said. "That's harder than it sounds." He felt the boy watching the side of his face. He didn't look up. The solder cooled and went dull, which was how you knew it had done its work. By the time the third week of February put a morning of warmish air through Dunmore, the temperature climbing above freezing for the first time in 6 weeks, the snow going gray at the edges and soft, Silas had stopped thinking of himself as temporary. He hadn't said this. Cass hadn't said anything equivalent. What happened was smaller than language. She began leaving the porch light on when he was coming for dinner. A pair of his work boots appeared at the back door and stayed there. Trace stopped asking, "Is Silas coming back?" and started asking when. He thought sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, about what he'd meant to do when he first came. The story he'd told himself. He turned it over and examined it the way he examined a joint before soldering, looking for the gap, the place where it would fail. It hadn't been entirely wrong. He had loved Miller. He still did, in the way you love a person who is no longer present to complicate the loving. But Miller had understood something about Silas that Silas was only now arriving at. That grief had given him the first legitimate reason in his adult life to stop standing at the edge of things and walk in. He hadn't come to save two people from a void. He had come because a void was the one door he knew how to open. On a Thursday evening after the dishes, Trace went to bed without being asked, which happened approximately never. Silas was at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee. Cass was at the counter. The refrigerator ran. A car went by on Mercer Road, headlights sweeping the window and gone. "I keep thinking I should tell you something," she said. She didn't turn around. He waited. "I don't know what it is yet." "Okay," he said. She turned around then and looked at him the way she had in the utility room in January, directly, without the side glance, as though she'd finished triangulating. "You want more coffee?" "No." "Okay," she said. She put the pot back. She folded the dish towel over the oven handle, then picked it up again and held it a moment longer than she needed to before setting it down. He saw this. She saw him see it. Neither of them mentioned it. Later, after she'd gone to bed, Silas went out to the garage. The fluorescent light buzzed, flickered, held. He stood in the cold space and looked at Miller's workbench, the pegboard with its tools outlined in marker where they were supposed to hang, the row of shelves along the back wall, orderly and unsentimental, the way Miller had kept everything. The red toolbox sat on the workbench, lid open. He'd moved it there 3 weeks ago when he needed the shelf space for the new shutoff parts. The wrench he'd used on the pipe repair lay across the top tray, slightly apart from the others. He'd set it down meaning to wipe it off and kept forgetting. He picked it up now, wiped it with a rag, and set it back in the tray with the rest. He looked at the box, the dented corners, the rust at the hinges, the blocky capitals of Miller's name worn and oxidized, difficult to read now in this light. He put his hand flat on the lid. He closed it. He left it where it was. In the morning he was in the kitchen before anyone else was up. He made coffee and stood at the window above the sink, looking out at the backyard, the pale gold of dead grass going soft in the early light, the fence Miller had built 10 years ago and never quite finished painting, the field beyond running flat to the tree line at the edge of somebody else's property. The glass was cold. He could feel it from 2 inches away, radiating in the half-second before the warmth from inside turned it into something else. His breath fogged the pane and cleared and fogged again. From somewhere behind him came the sound of the furnace and the creak of a floorboard and then a door, and then the small particular sound of Trace's feet in the hallway. The coffee finished dripping. A truck went by on Mercer Road, diesel and early and gone. Silas stood at the window. He didn't move.